Do that again. We get started in 5, 4, 3, 2. All right, folks, welcome back to the first afternoon panel on day one of the 16th annual CUNY BMI conference. I'm Dr. Sean Best, University Director for the CUNY Black Male Initiative, and we're so delighted to have an amazing group of esteemed panelists today for this conversation on 9 minutes, 39 seconds, the psychological effects of systemic police violence and misconduct in our communities. All right, folks, welcome back to the And let me turn off my live stream so this doesn't happen anymore. My apologies. Give me a second. I'm Dr. Sean Best, University. All right, and so double live stream, not only from my computer, but also my web browser. My apologies, we're back. So let's jump on into this conversation. Obviously, we're gonna be talking about policing in the Black community, and also just fundamentally, how are police trained? How do we cultivate an environment in our world that allows police and our law enforcement to make sure that they're valuing the lives of Black and brown people all over the country, especially locally. I live in Harlem, and so I've been personally in touch with many police officers and law officers who are supporting our communities, and these important conversations need to happen. So without further notice, one of our CUNY All-Stars, Professor Gloria Brown Marshall, who is Professor of Constitutional Law at John Jay College and also an on-air host at WBAI 99.5 FM radio with Bob Law and that crew over there that we love so much. We are so delighted to have you, Gloria, leading this conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to you for the next 45, 50 minutes, and then I'll jump back in at the end. So the ball's in your court. And to the panelists, thank you for being with us. We're so excited for you all joining us today. Gloria, it's on to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sean. And one thing that I have to say is that I am so honored to be here. I'm here with Mark Claxton, and he and I have been in this work together for a minute now. And he is a retired New York Police Department detective, a 9/11 World Trade Center first responder. He's had 20 years of a policing career in uniform and plain clothes. Right now, he's the Director of Safety and Security for Richland County School District in Columbia, South Carolina. But he was also the founding member of 100 Blacks in Law Enforcement Who Care. And that's very important. That's going to be a key to part of this conversation we're having. And of course, history is being made as we are going to be, I hope, in the near future, I don't want to jinx it, but talking to the first Black DA of Manhattan, and that is Alvin Bragg. And Alvin Bragg, I will say, has had an illustrious career as a prosecutor. And so he began his career in many different areas, but decided to settle in on being a prosecutor. He was at the Southern District of New York, where he was assistant U.S. attorney. He was a chief deputy attorney general, and he investigated police-involved civilian killings. He has been a part of New York Law School, a co-director of the Racial Justice Project, and he's been a part of not just of the idea of prosecution as, of course, part of what we need to have as a society in which there's been harm to community, and therefore there has to be some type of adjudication. But he's also played a role in the Legal Aid Society as a member of their board of directors, and in many other ways, he's been a part of our community. These are two New Yorkers who are going to talk about criminal justice. And so let's get started. And one of the things that we see from our title, 9 minutes and 36 seconds, we're, of course, referring back to George Floyd. What happened in that case, the killing that we all witnessed, and then the resounding, we would say, criminal trial that took place, all of this making national and international news. But let's just go down to the nitty gritty. Let's look at criminal justice. And I'll give this very quick background. We've already agreed in our prior conversations that we know criminal justice in this country has a racially biased slant to it. But why? Well, we have to think about this. It was 1669 in Virginia, the colony of Virginia, 1669, when a law was passed to allow for the killing of an African by a European, and that killing would not result in a felony conviction. That was 1669. That was a law on the books in Virginia. There were many laws that led into chattel slavery. We also know that there were slave catchers, there were militia put together to put down Indian or Native American uprisings. We had from there this amalgam that became in the 1800s what we know as our modern day police force, a mixture of what happened with the European bobbies and then what was already part of what was to protect white people from people of color for the most part. Rising up from that, we've never really addressed the racial basis of our police departments or our policing system. And so when we have our resulting 1,000 plus people who die at the hands of police every year, we have this sense that we're in this helpless situation. But there have been other times in our past in which we've had national reform that has led to, for example, the Voting Rights Act that led to a Black president, a Black vice president. Can we reform our system is how we're going to end this. Let's begin it with what is our system? And I want to start with our first look. When police come, Mark Claxton, when police come in to address a person, they believe that there's been some type of incident. What is the mindset between that police officer, and this is a generalization, you would just give us your insights, between that police officer and that civilian?
I apologize. It's a major violation right there. So what should be the mindset is evaluating the situation as it presents itself before you. You shouldn't go in with any preconceived notions, but quite frankly, what happens too often and most often is that the police officer carries with him his experiences, his prejudices, his opinions, his ideas, a lot of news material and his socio-political positioning and dealing and addressing with the public. So they carry all that baggage into this interaction. And that sometimes leads to some painfully and tragically predictable circumstances because you're not going in open and allowing the evidence as it lays out before you to dictate how you interact with the person. I should go in as a police officer, and the training is, although it's hypocritical, the training is that you go in with the information that you have, open-minded, and allow for the situation to unfold and develop organically. Don't prejudge because you'll make some mistakes. And what we found is oftentimes those mistakes turn out to be fatal mistakes.
So when there is a police officer who believes something criminal has happened, and that person is now detained, and they're taken to the precinct, what's happening there? What's the mindset of those people who have now encountered the civilian who is now within the precinct? And I always like to tell my students at John Jay, when we take our criminal justice classes, that the only thing protecting that person, that civilian in the police precinct, is the Constitution, because all the people around him or her have weapons. And no one can get to that civilian except if the police allow it to happen. So now, what is the sense of this person? Is this person already considered guilty while they're being questioned, or what's going on now within the police precinct?
What's supposed to have happened is that the police officer goes from a position of perhaps mere suspicion to a position of reasonable suspicion. And if they're taking that person into custody, that would require them to have probable cause that a crime has in fact occurred. So that police officer is working under the premise that a crime has occurred and they have the quote unquote criminal there, and they are to begin the processing and assisting with the prosecution of that individual. That's textbook according to how it's supposed to go. But like I said, it's important that we have to be realistic about how people interact with one another generally and how police officers tend to interact with the public. And that is that they are carrying along with them, yes, a lot of the understanding and the training and tactics that they have learned in the police academy, but they're also coming along with their own personal experiences, their life experiences, those prejudices that they carry into the policing profession. And they are then allowing those determinant factors decide how they interact, how they proceed with prosecuting or arresting individuals, and how they treat those individuals.
And so now you heard that word, prosecution. Mr. Bragg, Alvin Bragg, where are you as far as a prosecutor goes in your relationship with policing when this person who's now in the precinct has been processed? When does prosecution enter the scene? Alvin, are you on mute?
I'm off. I think it defaulted to mute. Yeah. So look, as Brother Claxton did, I'll sort of give you what has happened, and then maybe some ideas of what could happen differently. I'm going to trust that most people watching have seen Law and Order, right? I mean, that a lot about that's fiction, but the basic premise that the police go out and they have the first half hour of the TV show and they are doing what Brother Claxton just said, and then the second half of the show is when they go downtown and they go to court and there's an arraignment. We've seen that on TV many times. So that is the traditional path, right? The person is arrested, and then the officer will go to what's called the complaint room, and will meet with usually a junior prosecutor, and will do what they say, kind of write up the case, write up the accusation, and then they'll go before the court, and the judge will either set bail or release the person. That's the classic sort of situation. What I think we need to be looking at is, the prosecutors having a more active role, a gatekeeping function, right? So, not kind of just being in this role of kind of reflexively processing, but much more actively making determinations at that stage. And then, of course, then if it goes forward, working in active partnership with the police to continue to investigate and get the defense the materials they need.
So we're now to the point where, say, the prosecutor decided they're going to go forward with prosecution. Sometimes, and I've had friends who are prosecutors, my background, as I tell people all the time, I'm a civil rights attorney. I have not been a prosecutor. That's not my choice that I wanted to make. I always wanted to be a civil rights attorney. But here's my major concern, that subjective or objective determination that we're going forward. So how is that made? How is the prosecution deciding in this particular situation we're going forward? And I know that's very general, but I'm just wanting to give people something that could touch on what they see in Law and Order, but what's going really behind the scenes here.
Right. So, definitely, vary depending upon, what the allegation is, but, take something like a street fight, right? The officer may on one hand say, I saw, X punch Y, in which case that you're relying on the officer's word. The officer may say, I was a 911 call and I showed up. And then what they're doing is getting a statement from the person who says they were punched. They're getting a statement from Y, which will say X punched me. And that often the timing is tight. As you know, as a civil rights lawyer, there's a window in which folks have to be presented to the court. In New York City, that's generally 24 hours. And they're relying on pretty much the very first round of investigation, right? You may not have things yet like surveillance video or things like that. And so that's what's happening. I guess what I was saying earlier is to really push to use that time to make as much of a considered decision as possible, instead of sort of just saying, okay, well, this is what the officer said, or this is what X said. X said he was punched. So, well, no, look, there's no bruise on him, right? He has a ring on his finger. Like, did that punch really happen? Really probing more. I think historically, we've thought, okay, we'll figure this out later, and I include both the arresting officer and the prosecutor in that. Like, we'll do this. We've got probable cause. I think, I've spent some time as a civil rights lawyer too. So the civil rights lawyer says that, every moment in incarcerated is really a tax. And so that which we can figure out earlier saves obviously some human dignity and liberty restrictions, taxpayers' money, and government resources. So really trying to front load with the lawyer, the prosecutor playing an active role in it.
Okay, so now we're up to something's going wrong here when it comes to Black and brown people. Somewhere we've talked about the subjectivity of the officer encountering the situation, what they saw. Let's just take one moment of something that we can all take into consideration that we know, and that's the George Floyd case. We're just going to look at some of those front-loaded facts. At what point when, for example, George Floyd is being accused of passing this bill that's seen later as a counterfeit bill. When we talk about law enforcement making this decision, or even with Eric Garner, with the loose cigarettes, at one point does law enforcement say, we're taking you into the precinct? And that's what I'm going back to you, Mark. You know, this subjectivity seems to be resulting in a disproportionate number of Black people who are being arrested, who are being prosecuted. Where are we failing in our system when it comes to the subjectivity? What is happening is decided perhaps it's better safe than sorry. If you didn't do this, you probably did something else. Or is the burden of proof on the person of color? Well, if you can prove that it wasn't you, then you can go free. What's the breakdown here where it's falling apart? Mark?
There are a few different points of breakdown normally, and one point of breakdown is, as I had indicated, prejudging a situation on the part of the police officer, prejudging a situation on the street, and then oftentimes that will lead to a misuse of force, meaning that we no longer use our continuum of force, which is also trained in police academies throughout the nation, where you meet a certain level of force or resistance with an equal level of force and resistance. Oftentimes, an individual asserting themselves verbally will result in a quote unquote professionally trained police officer engaging in a heightened physical interaction. So there's oftentimes that abuse of force situation that occurs, which would then lead to a person being unnecessarily detained. Sometimes, if it's not an actual crime, if it's a violation of law, those things can be resolved right there on the street, usually by the issuance of a summons.
And that's let me just add to that point. It could be resolved right there. Isn't that the subjective point, whether or not the officer wants to resolve it right there?
Yeah, oftentimes it is. And sometimes what you will find is that police officers, one, they also have the opportunity to warn and admonish. They have a wide range of discretion at that point. They don't have to necessarily choose to incarcerate or even summons a person at that point. But yes, the police officer has a wide range of discretion, and he could issue a summons. Too often what happens is the police officer is looking to enhance the offense, enhance their arrest ability, where quotas come in. And that's also a danger that we have to recognize. If a person is working based on quotas and they have an opportunity to enhance something that should have been maybe a violation of law and make it into a crime, some police officers have been known to do that. And now this is an important part, as Mr. Bragg was talking about, when that police officer now is explaining what occurred and they're writing up that complaint, that really is such an important time. And police officers know that there are certain prosecutors who will just accept what you convey to them. There are others who ask very serious and pointed questions, trying to clearly establish that you had probable cause to effect the arrest and there's enough evidence to move on. And that's why it's important that you don't have as incestuous a relationship between police and prosecutors as unfortunately we do have, and that you have a prosecutor's office that it serves as a check to police powers. It's necessary and it's important, because for those times when the police officer goes far and beyond what's necessary or what is legal, you would then have the prosecutor being able to stop it right at that particular point, so you can avoid these tragedies that we hear about oftentimes.
Okay, then thank you so much. Now going back to Alvin Bragg. So now here we are, Mr. Bragg. We're looking at this person who's before the prosecutor. I want to ask this question, and I don't know if there's been asked before to any prosecutor. Is there a quota similar to the police department that the prosecutors have? Are they trying to make their Jones? Are they trying to impress the boss? And when they're trying, is there a number if they look, we've closed or opened and closed these certain number of cases, we prosecuted a certain number of people? Is there some bragging rights? What's going on that would motivate a prosecutor to just continue to take these cases, even if they have some questionable parts to them?
Yeah, so quota per se, I think might be not the precise word, but I would say bad institutional incentives, right? So if the person who gets promoted all the time is the person who charges the most cases, you haven't sent out a memo saying charge as many cases as you can. But if that's the way you move up an institution, we all know we take your cues from, if it's who's in the corner office or whatever it is that gets you promoted. People are examining that. Also, there can be funding streams, different types of grants, different types of sources of funding that are driven by the number of charges brought and the number of charges. So we've got to redo that. We can't have our sort of those kind of perverse incentives driving the train, so to speak. So that's one thing I'm looking at, change, when I go back into government. I wanted to go back to, you mentioned George Floyd and I think Eric Garner.
Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about, we've been talking about sort of the officer on the street. I wanted to pan back and talk about a lot of this is not just the officer, but it's institutional priorities. And so when you think about Eric Garner, we had, the highest levels of the NYPD decided they were going to prioritize untaxed cigarettes, or what we call them, my neighborhood Lucy's. And that's a decision that means going really corner to corner, targeting mostly young Black men. And in Eric Garner's case, while he was actually breaking up a fight, he was alleged to have been selling loose cigarettes. And so I think the question that we've got to be asking is how we want to deploy police. Like I don't think, I'm sitting on a block that's had near it 3 gun incidents in the last 3 weeks. I'd much rather the police officers in my local precinct looking at those gun incidents and not arresting someone and looking at someone who's selling loose cigarettes. So I think that kind of macro and priority setting, which is not the sort of individual discretion we were talking about earlier, but is the kind of thing that we can control as policymakers. It's how we're going to deploy our government resources and making sure they're deployed around things that actually give rise to legitimate public safety issues.
So, but that also, and thank you for that, that also then takes us back to, because I really want to focus on this prosecutorial discretion issue that's rarely discussed. People rarely talk about the fact that prosecutors have such discretion and subjectivity as to whether or not they're going to bring a particular case, whether or not there's enough force in the community vocal support to say, we want this focus on this particular area that rises up. Maybe the business owners said, we need to start doing something about Lucy's. And that voice is what, caused the policy change to take place. And so when it comes to prosecutors, for one, and I'll just say this, there are plumbers that cheat. There are used car dealers who cheat. And so there are crooked people in policing, and there are crooked people who are in prosecutors' offices. I mean, as an African-American, as we are inheriting a system that we could have pride in our jobs, but there are crooked lawyers. So we can't have so much pride in our jobs that we're blind to the history of the crookedness that's racial bias that is part of the job we inherited or the career we're in. So now we have this prosecutor, and I'm just going to say this because we've had cases go to the US Supreme Court with prosecutors who acted with racial biases who kept their jobs. When you say there's this person who's like charging just to get ahead, what's the consequence to that person? Who is supposed to be the check and balance within the prosecutor's office to stop that from happening?
Yeah, so look, we need systems in place to do that. And for far too long, those systems have been anemic. We need, I think, one, to change the initial inputs so that we're not creating these incentives for people to do things that aren't advancing justice. And then for people who then run through those and do it anyway. But the very first thing is, right, just like any other employment context, right, you can be have adverse job action all the way up to termination. That seldom happens, right? We've seen courts issue rulings about prosecutors who withheld evidence, or we've seen in the exoneration context convictions set aside, but then seldom does anyone go the next step and fire the prosecutor. And we need to be doing that. I have not only prosecuted, law enforcement, meaning people in uniforms. I prosecuted a prosecutor. When I was in the Attorney General's office, we we prosecuted the district attorney in an upstate county because we felt that he was, did not handle properly the investigation of the shooting of an unarmed Black person. So, like you said, no one's above the law, right? We talk all the time about these, this concept of one standard of justice under the law, and that's got to include everyone. That includes the prosecutors who bring the cases. That includes the police officers. That includes judges. Includes everyone.
But they are above the law because in your case, he was acquitted, correct?
He was acquitted, and that I think that was unfortunate. And he was acquitted by a judge. He opted. We can talk about the dynamics of these cases. Oftentimes, when we have a case where someone is prosecuted, in law enforcement, they opt for a judge as opposed to a jury, which is something you can do under New York law, which federal law, you actually need the prosecutor's consent. So yeah, he was acquitted by the judge in that matter. But I think we have to bring the cases. You have to bring the cases, and I thought that was an unfortunate outcome. He did, I think as a result of the case, face consequences at the ballot box. He was voted out, and I think I'm not sure now what the status is, but he still has at least the possibility of some sort of sanction from the bar. But you're right; it's too far apart when these actions are taken, and then when they are taken, we don't often get what I believe is the right result. But I just think we've got to double down. I mean, it's not like we can't just stop doing it, right? We've got to create the systems to deter the conduct in the first instance. And then when someone does it, we got to use administrative action, civil action, and we're warranted criminal action.
But when you say we, who's the we? Now let me just finish this part. Who's the we? Here we are, and this is given a very slanted view of what the bar looks like. Because we're sitting here and we're not the we for the most part. And there are some of the we who would not be us. And so when I'm thinking about making these changes, that not only do we have hundreds of years of failures of prosecutors to prosecute to protect the rights of people of color, but we have, prosecutors who won't prosecute other prosecutors, and prosecutors who turn a blind eye to what they know is what you just said, people who are making their way up the ladder. And these are government employees. So who's supposed to do this? So
maybe I have a pronoun issue that I need to start changing. My hope is that come January 1, the we is me. You're right. This panel is not reflective of our justice system, and something I don't know if this was on the agenda to talk about, but I think we should talk about it. And people I know have very strong and competing views on this, but we got to have a seat at the table. I mean, this is why I ran, why I've chosen to do these cases, why I've been both a civil rights lawyer and a prosecutor, because I think we need to have the us in these seats making these decisions. And a lot of times, and Brother Claxton may have had similar experiences, right? You get, well, why are you doing that job? Why are you doing that? And it's so that the we becomes it's us. It really is. We're not looking to someone else to come outside and make decisions that will have such an impact on our community. We know these decisions impact our community unlike any other community. So let's sit in the seats and have the discretion be about how we deploy the discretion.
Well, I want to go to the question, which is something that the conversation that we need to have and have had. And when I say having the conversation, then I have to ask the question, have you had the conversation? And I'll start with Mark this time. Have you had the conversation, Mark, with your own son and perhaps daughter? And then we'll go to Alvin Bragg. And we already know what the conversation is.
Well, I've absolutely had the talk, the conversation a few times beyond even my immediate family. And as part of that conversation, I want to say this, and it may tie into what we were just discussing. As part of that conversation is me sharing the reality that the threat comes not just from people who are of a different hue or complexion, but from people who are wrapped up or tied up in certain cultures and traditions. You see, in the police department, and I'm sure in prosecutors' office across the nation, even those officers that may be more reflective of us, may be more Black and brown, we find that there is not a significant difference in the level of abuse that occurs in those particular offices. Why? Because, well, like they say, not all our skin folk is our kinfolk, but aside from that, it's deeper than just the color. It's deeper than just the race of those people who are in different positions. It deals with the culture of, in my case, policing. Policing culture really subsumes everything else. So if there are many cases, and there are many individuals who I know and have had experiences with that, Black and brown and Latino brothers and sisters who come into policing a particular way and end up being subsumed by the policing culture. And a few years later, you can't even recognize them. And they offer you, the community, no greater advantage or safety cushion because they've been subsumed by policing culture. So the short answer is yes, I have given a talk to many people about, the conduct, what's expected, the realities, and what we can do to protect ourselves and survive the situations.
And I want to turn now to Alvin Bragg. Have you had the conversation? And when you did, if you don't mind, tell us what you said.
Yeah, so look, I've had the conversation in lots of contexts. I've got two children, one teenage, one preteen, and so I've had it with them. Probably most poignantly for me, in the beginning of the pandemic, my son said to me that he's 11, that he didn't want to wear a face mask. And I said, well, you understand that, this could help you, prevent the spread. He said, I get all that. But I don't want to wear a mask because I don't want the police to shoot me because they think I'm a robber, right? You want to talk about internalizing trauma? That's an 11-year-old speaking. So having the conversation where we, are telling people about their rights, telling them about how to have a interaction in a way that make sure that they are securing their rights, but also making sure they live through the encounter, but also in a way that's affirming, right? I mean, because they are seeing all of this, they're seeing all the images, I think, in a way that we didn't growing up because of social media, and so that you're telling them this, but also to be affirming and say like, yeah, that's that is right. You are right to make that astute observation, but also to talk to them about balancing that in this instance with the face mask and how to then react if something like happens. And then ultimately at his age, it's something like, well, I'm gonna be with you when you're outside, and I'm gonna be there. So I think in some ways we got to wrap them in some love as well. I'm seeing some of the chats asking about,
I'm gonna ask the question. Don't worry about it, brother. I got you.
Oh no, I was gonna tie it into the answer. Just one of the times that did the talk, was to an audience, church audience of my church, to a bunch of youth, and in that context was asked kind of the sort of how can you do this work. So, I'll address that when we get to the question there.
Yeah,
can I say one more thing? And what my organization, I'm the director of Black Law Enforcement Alliance now, and one thing that we've done is just to affirm ourselves and our community is we've shifted away. We actually have interactions and discussions and seminars about surviving police interaction. So we shifted away from what used to be called what to do when stopped by police, because that really places you in more of a defensive position. We now, our workshops are entitled Surviving Police Interactions, because it puts us more in an affirmative position as opposed to the defensive position. How do we just survive, and how do we take this abuse one way or another? But that's how we categorize it now: surviving police interactions, because it's that serious, and we need to be affirmed in our positions.
Yeah, but once again, who the we is who the we are. I want to go back to Alvin when we were starting that. Here's the thing, because I want to connect these two together. We're giving the talk, we're having the conversation on the one side, but on the other side, one of the questions is, what do we do inside? When we have people in our jobs, we see who are abusing their positions, whether or not they're prosecutors or they're police officers. This connects to that question we have also in the chat. How do we make those changes? And then how do we address the backlash that comes from that? when we have people we are working with who decide to speak up, that we see that there's been harm, because harm can take place. This happens because people pretend it doesn't. And that includes those people of color. I see them before they go into policing. And I understand that they want to help their communities, but I don't know what happens to them once they get through the academy. And as Brother Mark said, become a part of that culture. Same thing with prosecutors. And I've seen Black, brown, and white prosecutors who are gung-ho when we're all like outside. When they get in, there's a mindset that comes. Some of them leave because they don't want to be a part of the mindset, whether or not the prosecutors are police officers. How do you and people make that change from the inside and then deal with the backlash once the change happens, or once they voice their opposition to being a part or being subsumed within that culture? And I'll start with Alvin, because you were talking about this before, and then we'll go over to Mark.
I think, cultures, I mean, there's definitely backlash that will come when you speak out, to people who haven't been in these environments. You just think about any work environment where you're sort of the dissident voice, and then in these cultures it's more pronounced, and so I mean it takes resolve. I think a lot of the work takes resolve, takes independence, and I think it's probably different for policing, but I think also for the prosecutorial function, I think it's healthy to go do something outside the law. I mean, there are obviously people who do it for 50 years. And I found for me, moving offices, getting fresh perspective was important personally. And I think that that's important in an office too, to have that kind of, transitions and people in and new voices. So it's not becoming kind of staid. So if you do have one person who's there for a while, you're having other people coming in with different perspectives, and it's not like we're going to, do it the way we did it in 1970. So I think that that's important. I know for me, the way I've managed it is by being in different places, and having broad perspective. And you can actually say like, hey, look, over here, we did it this way. We should try it this way here, because it was effective, fairer, and by the way, also helped keep us safe.
Thank you. So Mark, once again, here we have, you're giving the talk to one person. You're having that conversation on the outside, and on the inside, you're seeing this. When you were in the force, how do you connect these things? How do you balance out the fact that you have to give the talk on the outside to your loved ones, and then on the inside, your job, you're seeing that, people are being subsumed into the culture, and that there's backlash for those who speak up?
Well, I mean, I always spoke truth to power, and I've always been honest with those people who came in who I thought maybe had lost an idea about who they were. I mean, I had to deal with them, they're my colleagues, but there were a few things that I always did without question. And there are a lot of people, there are some brothers and sisters in policing who carried themselves the same way. And that is always just be very forthright about what you will and will not accept, and what you will and will not tolerate. Make it clear that you're not into the groupthink thing, and you're going to survive this situation, even though you're kind of, bogged down in a lot of groupthink and cliquishness and this culture that you really don't relate to. I came in and was able to successfully bring with me that which raised me and gave birth to me. I didn't abandon it at the door. So, and I made it clear to those around me that was my position from very early on in the police department. There were several other brothers and sisters that I know that carried themselves the same way. So therefore, everybody knew what the deal was right from the beginning. So those offenses and abuses of our communities didn't happen around me, because cops are smart enough to know who they could do certain things around. That George Floyd incident couldn't have happened around me. The incident of Eric Garner, it could have happened around me. They would never have considered or thought to do that, because there would have been a reaction from me. So I carried myself with a certain level of integrity and cultural connection, understood where I came from, and I demanded that those around me respected me in that way. And they, in short order, didn't do any of that stuff around me. So I heard about things and read about things and responded and reacted to those things in real time, but those things didn't curb in my surroundings. And I worked in narcotics for several years. I started my career in Central Harlem. I went on to narcotics. I ended up my career in Brooklyn. But, I really carried with me, where I was raised in Brooklyn, with me into the police department and made it clear I would tolerate, what I wouldn't tolerate. And that's missing too often in law enforcement and other professions as well. I didn't do the go along to get along thing.
Okay, so let's as we're going down in our time, I want to get to the heart of what a lot of people want to know. 9 minutes and 36 seconds. When there's this encounter, we see the prosecutor's office, we see the police department, and yet we have over 1,000 people dying at the hands of police every year. Now that we started keeping records through the Washington Post, but my concern is this fear for your life. You have prosecutors who are supporting a police officer who claims he feared for his life. The same things that could have taken place with a white civilian, when the person is a person of color, especially African-American, all of a sudden there's a fear factor that we don't see normally. I want to know, and I think you can start off, Mark, what happens when that white officer, for the most part, and those, we're just gonna go with the white officer right now, interacting with African-American, that ends in this sense that I fear for my life. Since we so rarely have any prosecution to know what actually was going through the mind of the officer, what can you tell us? This fear for my life and this split-second decision. You've got to stance on that. I think would be very informative.
Yeah, well, one thing to start off, there are no split-second decisions when you're dealing with these fatal shooting encounters. Shooting an individual requires several steps. The police officer, very briefly, the police officer has to recognize a certain level of threat. He has to place his hand on the weapon. That's another step. He has to take the weapon out from the holster or whatever. That's another step. He has to point in an unsafe direction. That's another step. He has to put his finger on the trigger. That's another step. He has to squeeze the trigger. There are several steps. There are no such thing as these, split-second shootings. There were a series of steps that the police officer quickly had to evaluate and decide to make in each and every shooting. And if you want to successfully prosecute police officers, you have to begin to break that down so that people realize it wasn't just something that happened without any kind of real significant thought or processing. Too often what happens in these fatal encounters is that the police officer has the justification of, I fear for my life. But what we don't really fully examine is who created the circumstances that led to that fear. We have this thing called police-created jeopardy that really isn't examined as well. Sometimes, too often, in many of these cases that are high, well-known cases, resulted from police-created jeopardy. These insignificant, what should have been insignificant interactions that end up in fatalities. Why? Because the police created the jeopardy. They started a series of events or a chain of events that led to an escalation of tensions that ultimately resulted in a police officer becoming fearful for their safety or for their lives. But if you back it up and examine, well, how did that start? How did Eric Garner start? That would tell you who created the scenario and the situation that led to the death of Eric Garner and who should be responsible for it. You can't start a situation, escalate it, and then it gets to a point where you would technically be justified for using deadly physical force, and then say, well, I shouldn't be prosecuted for it because I had to use I was fearful for my life. That's what happens oftentimes. And it becomes, in policing and in these police shootings and police killings, fearing for life that's just casual talk at this point that isn't fully examined or broken down or heavily scrutinized, both in the specific steps that a professional police officer was trained in, that he took part in, or in the mindset of the police officer going into this particular interaction.
So we're turning to the prosecution. There's so much there, Alvin. I want to, if you could also define some of these terms What is the legal standard from that side of it that a police officer is able to do, and how that's distinguished from qualified immunity, which is after the injury has taken place and there's a civil case. But if you could speak to any of those points that Mark raised in addition to those two questions, I'd really appreciate it.
Sure. I think we need to change our law. We've talked about culture. We need to do that. But our law, what Mark was just talking about, that concept, which I think is really intuitive and common sense. If you're sitting around, and I come run up on you and you punch me, even if I haven't punched you, for two civilians, we have a concept there, right? That's in the law. Who was the first aggressor? If it's two non-police officers, the notion of risk creation is not in our state something that is, in the statute, and something that is, while it may come out at trial, is not something that would give rise to criminal liability, and it's something that needs to, I think, be codified and put into the law. In addition, most of us grow up, thinking like, hey, whether you get the notion from the Bible, whether you get the notion from some other mores, it's like, hey, you can't take a life unless that's your matter of last resort. That's not the law in New York State if you're a police officer, right? And so I think we need to be examining, while we're thinking about changing cultures, while we're thinking about these other sort of inputs, who we're recruiting to do this work. We need to look at the law and change the law in a way that I think comports with the way everyday people are thinking about it, and remove some of these guardrails. That's all in the sort of criminal context. Qualified immunity, which we've been talking about, which some think the Supreme Court may walk back in the near future. Presents for officers, basically, it's a judge-made doctrine, which means if you violate someone's constitutional rights, that right has to be, quote, clearly established by law. And the courts, I think, by almost all accounts, have really gotten carried away with this, looking for like hyper technicality. So I'll exaggerate a little bit, but if I am an officer and I do something really bad and I shoot you, you didn't do anything, but I use my right hand. If in the next case the person uses left hand and says, oh, well, it wasn't established that you couldn't do it with your left hand. I'm exaggerating, but only by a little bit. We recently, in our city, walked back qualified immunity, which is an important step, but I think largely symbolic. Most of these cases are not adjudicated at the city level. The state level, I know there's I think a bill being carried on it, but really most of this is litigated in civil courts, in federal court, and that's why the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act addresses a number of these, and is really important because we need sweeping change throughout the country, and going locality by locality is not going to, not to minimize it, it's helpful, but we need change at the federal level.
I'm so glad you said that, because the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act does not contain anything that holds prosecutors accountable. And we know we're not supposed to kill people. We know that there's a racial bias in who gets killed by police, who gets harmed by police. But we have 18,000 police jurisdictions and a prosecutorial connection to all of those police jurisdictions. And so we when we talk about that, we are dealing with a majority community that is operating on police officers as celebrities, almost untouchables. And I'm putting that's my editorial piece on that. So I'm not putting that on either one of your shoulders. That's my take on this. And so therefore, how are we going to have prosecutors held to be accountable, as you pointed out earlier, if we have progressive prosecutors like you will be, and others here and there, Philadelphia, some places here, but 18,000 jurisdictions with prosecutors or DAs that still living under and working under the same doctrine that allows police officers to think they can get away with murder. So, what do we do for this national change that's going to take place, that would include all the states? And that's, when you think about coming into this job, and most people who are listening may or may not know this, Alvin Bragg and I think, like I said, going into November, will be the most powerful prosecutor in this country. You're witnessing history with these two men. We need to understand that. And with that power, as you know, comes great responsibility. And people will do across the board, prosecutors' offices look to New York. What is it that you can do until national reform is passed in the Congress that's going to at least bring to the table some of these people who need to make these changes a part of their policy?
Yeah. So first on the George Floyd justice policing, I would say that I think there's an important feature, a funding incentive for states to require special prosecutor in cases involving police killings. And I think that's important because, that was what we had in New York State. Most importantly, it's what they had in Minnesota with A.G. Ellison. So while not a cure-all, I think the result there may have been different if we didn't have A.G. Ellison doing that case. So I think that's an important development. In terms of, I'm a Manhattan exceptionalist. I've lived here my whole life. So I agree it's the most important place on earth. Y'all from another borough, forgive me. More broadly, New York City, I think we'll all agree on this call, right? We created hip hop that traveled, we got art and culture that's going around the world. And I think it's the same with prosecution, right? So the goal, and I'll just use an example from my late brother, Ken Thompson, he set up what was certainly a pioneering conviction review, exonerated a number of people in his short time in office. And that work in and of itself was profound and important for Brooklyn. But I think equally and probably more importantly, it's been enduring, right? He's passed away tragically and too early, but his work and his legacy lives on, I think, most prominently in that way. In Dallas, in Philadelphia, in other jurisdictions that have taken the model he created of bringing in someone from the outside to look back at old cases, and that models live beyond. So that's my hope. That's one example. I'm going to follow his model in that. But what we do here in Manhattan, whether it's prioritizing reentry, having prosecutors think at the time of the beginning of a case of what's this look like for when this person comes home. When 90% of people come home as they should, we need prosecutors to be thinking about that. The prosecutors are thinking about cases, prioritizing, thinking about the mental health diversion and substance use disorder. So I completely agree with you about sort of the kind of centrality, I would say, really of the entire city and getting it right, because other places look here just like they look here for everything else, and they model it on us. So that certainly is much on my mind these days.
Thank you. And Mark, did you want to have any comment on that? Because this, and you called it incestuous relationship. This incestuous relationship between policing and the prosecutor's office. How do we address that? I mean, this is something that as long as the police officers are doing the investigations, they're the ones testifying, they're the ones who are examining the evidence. There's got to be something that's going to break that in order for us to go forward with a sense that we can regain any semblance of trust in our police department, or, stop the dwindling trust we have in our prosecutor's office, that they are just working hand in glove, and that people of color will always be the collateral damage of that relationship.
I think one thing that we can do, and I have to thank you for doing it at the very beginning, and that is to give context, to give history on what policing is, how policing came about. And that was so important because when I came into the police department, I didn't know the history. I learned that history actually during the time that I was a police officer. But I think it would be important that as part of the training model, part of the academy training for police officers, that they take that history course. Federal law enforcement officers are required to have X amount of hours of civil rights history training. They go to Black museums and have courses on the civil rights movement, et cetera. So I think it would be important, one part, because there is no simple answer to this, but something that would be important to address is the lack of the education understanding about the history of the professions. And that could apply also for those individuals, those new prosecutors into the DA's office. It may be of value that they get a real serious history lesson, similar to what's done on the federal level, just to have an eye-opening experience. And in that lesson would be laid bare what has been this incestuous relationship between police and prosecutors. And they could also examine some of the bad outcomes that relationship has led to, but then understand the importance of having separate and distinct agencies and responsibilities and oversight, because that maintains the integrity of these prosecutions and instills confidence in not only policing, but in prosecutions as well.
As we get down to our last 2 or 3 minutes, I'd like to do 2 very quick things. One is, as it's necessary in law that we have law enforcement and we have prosecutors. That's a part of the reality of a society, especially ours right now. It might be better in the next generation, but right now, we need both of you in what you do. I want you to tell us, and Alvin Bragg, give us your website for those people who want to know more about you as you go into the general election. And of course, Mark Claxton, Brother Mark, if you could tell us more about your organization. But I also want you to speak to these young people who are watching. How do you address the conflict about everything we've said, and yet the desire that you want to be in this office of the prosecution, right? And this police department, right? That time you had pride in your career choices. How did you balance that pride in the career choices with the history we just talked about? And we have to make it very quick because Sean's here. You, Alvin, go first.
Oh, so I mean, look, I think we talked about some of this. It is, as Mark talked about, balancing, being true to yourself, keeping yourself. I talked about a concept when I was in management at the Attorney General's office of people bringing their whole self to work. And that's important. You've got to do that. And I would just say, I mean, I think for the students to be thinking about what they can do today, they should be thinking professionally, but like the protests of last summer, some of the law reform I talked about, didn't get the changes that I talked about, but they got the George Floyd Justice Policing Act, voted out of the House. At the state level, we got some reform done, and that was done through really youth-led, student-led activism. So yes, consider this as a career path. It may not be for you, but what you can do right now today is follow your passion and do something. Whether that's post something, whether that's talk to someone else, whether that's marshaling something that we've talked about, and putting it to use today.
And Mark, very quickly.
Well, I've recognized over the past couple of years as I watch young people demonstrating and demanding justice and receiving changes within the system itself, that there ain't nothing I could tell them to do, because my generation just didn't do that. So I sit back in admiration and respect for what they're able to do, and they know the course that leads them to victory.
I would say tithe your time and your talent. Be a weekend warrior. You don't have to do civil rights work full time, but you can give your time and your talent to your communities and know that this is a power situation and there's power in your hands. You realize that young people, all people are watching this. These 2 great men, thank you, Mark Claxton, thank you, Alvin Bragg, are in positions of power, and so are you. Use that power, use it wisely, and no, we didn't get here by accident. There were people who had less than we did and did a lot more with it. So as we go forward, do all you can to keep the movement going in a positive direction.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gloria. Wow, what an incredible conversation. I literally took so many notes. My notebook is just like filled up, and I'm going to share a lot of these resources with our community. But number one, remember, November 2nd, it's the time that we vote. We want to vote Alvin Bragg. I know I'm not supposed to say that, but I just did. We need to get him in on the office, and we need to make sure he replaces Cyrus, who's been there for a long time. So we're hopefully going to see the beginning of what is going to be a beautiful shift in culture and policy, and divorcing some of those incestuous relationships between policing and prosecution. I never heard until today the process of what police officers should go through before they decide to shoot someone. That was the first time. I think there's a lot of eyes that opened and were like, oh, wow, like we never heard it said quite that way before. There's no such thing as just a split decision or split second shooting decision. So thank you for the insight, the enlightenment. We'll include some of these resources in our recap. To the panelists, Gloria, you're always amazing. Thank you for being part of the CUNY BMI family. And just we look forward to collaborating more down the road, hopefully in person soon. So thank you all for joining. Absolutely, our pleasure. I know you're traveling and make time for us, so I appreciate you so much. We just thank you all for being here. We have one more panel happening in about 15 minutes, so stick with us. It's going down, and then we'll be closing day one activities. We're so thrilled to be talking in this afternoon panel about, make sure I get it right, strategically moving forward together in the Black Lives Matter movement. So please follow us at CUNY BMI. Keep on track with us. Invite somebody else to join us in about 15 minutes. And if you're not here for the rest of the day, come back tomorrow. We'll do this all over again at 10 a.m. We have Dr. Eddie Glaud, who's going to be speaking on his New York Times bestseller, Begin Again, the James Baldwin America and its urgent lessons for our own. So we look forward to seeing you all. Panelists, stay on with me for just 2 seconds. Everybody else, we'll see you in about 15 minutes.